The market is loud. Vendors calling out, cartwheels on stone, the smell of charcoal and steamed rice drifting through the air. A man walks through the middle of it without hurrying. People move aside. Not rudely, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of quiet, automatic respect. He isn't the largest man there, but something about him makes space open up ahead of him as he walks. It takes you a moment to understand what it is. Then you see it. 2 swords at his hip, one long, one short, both tucked through the sash at his waist. That's all. That's the difference. So the question is, why 2? What did the second sword actually do? In battle, in daily life, in the deepest corners of a warrior's identity. Those 2 swords weren't just weapons. In feudal Japan, they were a declaration, a legal status, a code of conduct wrapped in lacquered wood and forged steel. The practice had a name, a history spanning centuries, and a logic behind it that most people have never fully considered. The answer, it turns out, is more layered than most people expect. If you're the kind of person who likes history told this way, grounded, specific, and without the textbook voice, subscribing takes 1 second, and you'll never miss what comes next. The practice of carrying 2 swords is called daishō. The word breaks down simply: dai meaning large, sho meaning small, big and small. That's it, a deceptively plain name for something that became one of the defining symbols of an entire social class. At its most basic level, the daishō referred to a paired set of swords, one longer, one shorter, worn together at the waist. The combination most people recognize today is the katana paired with the wakizashi, though this specific pairing took time to arrive at. Earlier versions used different blades entirely. Before the katana existed as we know it, samurai would wear a long curved sword called the tachi, alongside a shorter blade called the tanto, essentially a fighting knife by modern standards. As sword-making evolved and combat conditions changed, these pairings shifted. The uchigatana replaced the tachi as the dominant longsword, a shorter companion blade followed, and eventually the katana emerged with the wakizashi as its standard partner. And that evolution matters more than it might seem. But that still doesn't explain why 2 became the standard. This wasn't a process driven by fashion or arbitrary preference. And this is where the logic starts to sharpen. Each transition happened because something about the battlefield had changed, or because craftsmen had found better proportions, better balance, better steel. The samurai class was, above all, practical. The weapons they carried reflected the conditions they actually fought in. What makes daishō interesting isn't just the pair itself. It's the question of intent. Why did 2 swords specifically become the standard? Why not 1 very good sword, or 3, or a sword and a spear? The answer sits at the intersection of combat logic, social engineering, and something harder to name. A kind of philosophy about what it meant to be always ready. Start with the practical side, because the practical side is genuinely elegant. The katana, the longer of the 2, was built for open space. Its curved blade and 2-handed grip made it extraordinarily effective for slashing and striking when there was room to move. On a battlefield, in a courtyard, in a street confrontation with space to draw and swing, the katana was the primary instrument. It was the sword most samurai trained with for most of their lives. Its length gave reach. Its curve concentrated force at the point of contact. In the right conditions, it was devastating. Conditions aren't always right. And the real problem appears when space disappears. Traditional Japanese architecture created a particular problem. Sliding doors, low frames, narrow corridors. These spaces didn't accommodate a full katana draw. The sword itself was often longer than a doorway was wide. In a tight indoor space, against someone close, the katana was genuinely difficult to use well. A long blade in the wrong environment becomes a liability rather than an advantage. The wakizashi solved this. Its shorter length, roughly 12 to 24 inches of blade, made it manageable indoors. In a narrow corridor, a fighter's elbow might brush one wall while his opponent pressed from 2 feet away. a distance where a long sword was already useless. It could be drawn faster in close quarters, used effectively in a low-ceilinged room, swung in a corridor where the katana would have struck the wall before reaching a target. It wasn't a lesser weapon. It was a weapon designed for a different set of circumstances. Carrying both meant a samurai was equipped for nearly any environment he might find himself in. This is the part that tends to surprise people. The two swords weren't redundant. They weren't a main weapon and a backup. They were complements, each one filling the gap the other left. And this is where function turns into something more than practicality. Now here's a detail that gets left out of most conversations about this. When a samurai entered a castle, a lord's residence, or any formal space of significance, etiquette required him to leave his katana at the entrance. This wasn't optional. It was a deeply embedded social custom, a gesture of respect, a signal that you weren't there to fight. Weapons of war didn't belong inside spaces of ceremony and protocol. Leaving the long sword at the door was the acknowledged form. But no one expected a samurai to walk into an unfamiliar building completely unarmed. The wakizashi stayed. It was acceptable to wear indoors precisely because it was the shorter, less overtly aggressive blade, and because everyone understood its practical purpose. A samurai without any sword in a politically charged environment was not just vulnerable. He was symbolically naked. The wakizashi bridged that gap. It allowed him to observe the etiquette of leaving his primary weapon behind while still retaining the personal protection and the dignity that came from being armed. That distinction shaped the daily experience of being a samurai in ways that are easy to overlook. The katana was the public sword, the one that announced his presence in open spaces, the one worn with ceremony and formality. The wakizashi was the constant one. It never left his side. Morning, evening, formal gathering, private moment. The shorter blade was always there, which brings us to something that rarely gets discussed in casual accounts of this tradition. The wakizashi's role extended beyond combat and courtesy. It was the sword of seppuku. Seppuku was the ritual act of self-inflicted death carried out by a samurai who faced profound disgrace. A failed mission, a dishonored lord, a defeat that could not be redeemed any other way. It was not considered suicide in the way that word is often understood. Within the samurai code, it was the ultimate assertion of personal honor, a choice made on the warrior's own terms at a moment of his own determination. And it was performed with a short sword. The wakizashi that never left his side was also the blade that served this final, irreversible purpose. That fact reframes the wakizashi entirely. It wasn't simply the indoor sword, or the backup blade, or the etiquette solution. It was a weapon that a samurai carried with the understanding that one day, in the most extreme of circumstances, he might use it on himself. That kind of awareness doesn't stay abstract. It shapes how you move through the world. It shapes the relationship a person has with the object they carry. The daishō, seen this way, wasn't just practical equipment. It was a meditation on being ready, for battle, for ceremony, for the worst that could happen, and for the response to it. If you're finding this interesting, a like helps more than you might think. Beyond the physical logic, something else was happening with the two swords. Something deliberately engineered by the people who held power in Japan. In 1629, a formal directive required samurai to wear the daishō while performing official duties. It wasn't a suggestion or a cultural norm that had been allowed to develop organically. It was law. A samurai on official business without both swords was in violation of his obligations. And then, in 1683, the rule was extended and sharpened further. The wearing of daishō was restricted exclusively to the samurai class. Not merchants, not artisans, not farmers, even wealthy ones. Samurai only. What that created was an instant, visible hierarchy. You could walk through any Japanese town and know, at a glance, exactly who belonged to the warrior class. Two swords said, "This person operates under a different set of rules. This person answers to a lord. This person has legal authority that you do not." No uniform required, no badge. The blades did all of it. For the samurai themselves, this visibility had a particular weight. It meant they were never simply private individuals moving through public space. They were always representing something, their lord, their class, their code. The daishō was a public marker they couldn't take off, not without consequences. In times of peace, when actual combat was rare, this is how the swords functioned most of the time. Not as weapons being drawn, but as signals being read. There's a certain pressure in that. Being constantly identifiable as a samurai meant being held to the standards of one in every interaction. With a merchant who felt cheated, with a stranger on a road at night, with anyone who decided to test what those two swords actually meant. The blades invited a particular kind of accountability that couldn't be set aside. One aspect of the daishō that often gets flattened in popular imagination is the question of the swords themselves, what they actually looked like and how they were obtained. Most people picture the two swords as a perfectly matched set. Same swordsmith, same steel, forged together as a pair, mirror images of each other in scale. That image is compelling, but it was the exception rather than the rule. What made a daishō was primarily its fittings: the scabbard, the handle, the guard, the decorative metalwork. When those elements matched in style and material, the pair was considered cohesive. The blades themselves didn't need to come from the same maker or even the same era. Commissioning both swords from a single swordsmith simultaneously was considerably more expensive and was simply beyond the means of many samurai, particularly those of lower rank. A warrior might inherit one blade, purchase another, receive one as a gift from a lord. What he assembled into his daishō was often a practical arrangement rather than an aesthetic vision. The matching fittings gave it visual unity. The rest was circumstance. The shogunate also regulated the appearance of the daishō for formal occasions, when attending a castle or appearing before authority. In those contexts, the scabbards were to be lacquered solid black and the hilt wrapped in white ray skin. The visual standardization wasn't about beauty. It was about legibility. Uniform presentation reinforced uniform status. It was a way of ensuring that the signal the swords sent was consistent and controlled. Wearing both swords every day had a physical reality to it that's worth pausing on. Both blades were worn through the obi, the cloth sash wound around the waist, with the edge facing upward. This allowed for a faster draw than the older style of wearing swords edge down, suspended from cords. But it also meant that the swords were always physically present, always exerting their weight against the body. Sitting down required shifting the scabbards outward so they didn't dig into the floor or catch against the body at an awkward angle. Walking required adjustment. You feel it every time you sit, adjusting the blades so they don't press awkwardly against your body. Entering through a low doorway meant being aware of the long sword's length. Bowing, kneeling, mounting a horse. All of it had to be done with the swords in mind. For a samurai who had trained since childhood, this awareness became seamless, second nature in the way that any deeply habitual thing becomes invisible. But for someone encountering it for the first time, or returning after a period without the swords, the physical presence of the daishō was noticeable. The weight was real. The spatial awareness required was constant. These weren't ornaments. They were objects that occupied physical space and demanded physical accommodation. That daily relationship with the swords, adjusting for them, maintaining them, keeping them clean and sharp and properly positioned, was part of what made the daishō an identity rather than just equipment. The practice of caring for the blades was itself considered an expression of discipline and respect. A samurai with neglected, poorly maintained swords was making a statement, and not a favorable one. But not everyone used the two swords this way. Now, most traditional schools of Japanese swordsmanship taught that only one blade of the daishō would be drawn in a given combat situation. You assessed the environment and chose accordingly. The second sword stayed sheathed. This was standard. This was what nearly every samurai practiced. And then there was Miyamoto Musashi. Musashi is one of those historical figures who seems almost too extreme to be real, except that the historical record is clear enough that doubting him becomes difficult. Born in the late 1500s, he fought his first recorded duel at around 13 years old. By his own account, he was undefeated in over 60 duels across his lifetime. He survived into his early 60s, which for a man who spent decades provoking some of the most dangerous swordsmen in Japan is its own remarkable fact. What Musashi developed, and promoted actively in the first half of the 1600s, was a method of fighting with both swords at once. He called it Naitoken, and it formed the foundation of the school he established, Niten Ichi Ryu, which translates roughly as two heavens as one. The method required holding each sword in one hand, abandoning the powerful two-handed grip that most swordsmanship depended on. In exchange, it offered constant simultaneous engagement. No pause between offense and defense. One sword pressing an attack while the other redirected an incoming strike. A flow of action that opponents found genuinely difficult to predict or interrupt. Musashi was clear that this style wasn't for everyone. It demanded unusual ambidexterity and years of dedicated practice, because the loss of the two-handed grip meant that raw power had to be replaced by timing and reading the opponent with exceptional precision. What's significant about Musashi here isn't just the technique, it's what it revealed. The daishō wasn't fixed. It could be approached differently depending on who was holding it. Musashi found a way to make the pair something it had never quite been before. His school survives today. Practitioners still study Niten Ichi Ryu, still train with both swords, still work through the forms Musashi developed. The technique that was radical in the 17th century is now part of the historical record of Japanese martial arts, preserved not because it became mainstream, but because it was genuinely extraordinary. The era of the daishō ended not with a battle, but with a bureaucratic act. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 set Japan on a path of rapid transformation. A new government, a new military structure, a new vision of what kind of nation Japan would become in a modernizing world. The samurai class, hereditary, hierarchical, defined by a tradition of personal martial identity, didn't fit cleanly into that vision. In 1871, the legal requirement to wear the daishō was formally abolished. The swords were no longer obligatory, and in 1876, the carrying of swords in public was banned for the general population. For many samurai, this was not a minor policy adjustment. The swords had been the most visible expression of their place in society for generations. Removing the right to wear them was experienced as a removal of identity, not symbolic identity, but the concrete, daily, publicly legible identity that the blades had represented for centuries. The samurai class was formally dissolved not long after. What had been a living tradition became history within a single generation, and yet the daishō didn't disappear. It transformed. The paired swords became objects of cultural preservation, collected, studied, displayed. The martial arts traditions that grew from samurai practice continued, adapted, and found new practitioners. The image of a warrior with two blades at his waist became one of the most recognized silhouettes in the world, crossing into literature, film, and art in ways that show no sign of fading. What's preserved isn't just the aesthetic. Serious students of Japanese martial arts today still engage with the underlying logic. The complementary relationship between the two blades, the discipline of maintaining constant readiness, the philosophy of being fully present in whatever environment you occupy. The tools are gone from daily life. The thinking behind them persists. So what was the daishō, taken as a whole? It was a combat solution. Two blades engineered for different environments, together covering the full range of situations a warrior might face. It was a legal marker. A pair of swords that told everyone in a given space exactly who you were and what authority you carried. It was a daily discipline. Objects that required physical awareness, regular maintenance, and constant accommodation. And it was something harder to categorize. A companion in the deepest sense, always present. Present even at the very end. The man walking through the market at the beginning of this, the one who moved through the crowd without effort, without aggression, without needing to say a word, carried all of that with him, not just in the blades themselves, but in what they represented and what they demanded. The respect he received wasn't fear of the swords. It was recognition of everything the swords meant. 2 swords, one always left at the door, one that never left his side. And in that difference, an entire philosophy of how to move through the world, prepared, visible, and accountable to something larger than yourself. What would it look like to carry your commitments the way a samurai carried those swords? Not as a burden, but as a definition. That's the question worth sitting with. If this gave you something to think about, you can share it. And if you want more like this, subscribe.